The ballroom held its breath as Marcus Kane, a billionaire with a temper as sharp as his suit, slammed his fist on the podium, silencing 150 elite guests. $2 billion on the line, and your numbers are a joke, he roared. Does anyone here understand me, or do I need to wave my hands in sign language? Nervous laughter sputtered, then died under his glare. In the shadows, Sophie Miller, a waitress with blonde hair knotted in a tight bun, moved silently, her black and white uniform crisp against the chaos of wealth. Her green eyes caught every sneer, every whisper, but she kept pouring water, steady and unseen, until the moment she'd change everything. The chandeliers gleamed over tables draped in white linen, silver cutlery clinking as CEOs and socialites in $1,000 outfits buzzed with tension. Sophie glided through, refilling glasses, her plain black shoes soft on the marble floor. She'd heard the jabs all night. A woman in a glittering gold dress leaned toward her friend, voice low but cutting. Bet she lives off tips and table scraps. A man with a shiny watch snickered, those shoes? Straight from a thrift store. Sophie's fingers tightened on the pitcher, but her face stayed calm. She'd chosen this job to escape a past where her family's name carried weight she didn't want. The insults stung, but she swallowed them, moving on with quiet purpose. Marcus's voice sliced through again, aimed at Paul Reed, an executive whose presentation had crumbled. Paul, sweating in a gray suit, stammered, "Mr. Kane will fix it. Don't pull the deal." The crowd shifted, their faces tight. A woman in a sapphire gown, diamonds heavy at her throat, called out, "Mr. Kane, your vision's brilliant. We'll make it right." Others nodded, piling on flattery, but Marcus wasn't listening. His blue eyes landed on Sophie, clearing a plate nearby. "You," he said, pointing, his tone sharp but curious. "Why aren't you scrambling like the rest?" Sophie set the plate down, her hands steady. "Just doing my job," she said softly, her voice clear in the tense silence. A man in a black tuxedo snorted, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Her job's wiping spills," he muttered, sparking laughter. The woman in the gold dress added, "She's dreaming if she thinks she belongs here." The chuckles spread, sharp and mean. Sophie's jaw tightened, but she didn't bite back. Instead, she moved to a spilled wine glass, the red stain pooling on the tablecloth. The guest responsible, a loud man with slicked back hair, didn't glance at her. He turned to the woman beside him, smirking. Maybe waitresses learn sign language for fun. Their table laughed, the sound biting into the air. Marcus's voice cut through like a blade. "I'm serious. Does anyone here know sign language?" The room froze. No one moved. Paul forced a chuckle. "Great metaphor, sir." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "It's not a metaphor." The laughter died. Sophie, kneeling to clean the spill, stood slowly, setting her cloth down. She stepped forward, her hands moving in quick, fluid signs, each gesture sharp with fluency. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Marcus's face softened and he signed back, his hands just as skilled. Whispers erupted. "The waitress knows sign language?" Paul's face paled, his hands gripping his chair. Marcus's lips curved slightly. "Finally, someone who gets it," he said. A woman in a red dress, pearls gleaming, stood, her voice sharp. "This is ridiculous. She's just a waitress." Murmurs grew, others joining in. "She's making fools of us," a man with a loud tie said, his face flushed. Sophie signed again, her hands steady. "Words don't need wealth to matter." Marcus translated, his voice firm. "She says words don't need wealth to matter." The man with the tie sank into his seat, his face red. The crowd's confidence wavered. Sophie stood tall, her blonde bun catching the chandelier light. A young server, her apron stained, slipped Sophie a small note. It read, "You're incredible. Don't stop." Sophie tucked it into her pocket, her eyes softening for a moment. Marcus caught the exchange and signed to her, "You're not alone." A woman in a green dress clapped slowly, her voice dripping sarcasm. "What's next?" "She'll teach us how to serve drinks." The laughter was weaker now, uncertain. Sophie didn't flinch. She signed, "Respect is earned, not bought." Marcus repeated her words, and the room went quiet. The doors swung open. A tall man in a simple black suit walked in. David Wells, Sophie's brother, moved with quiet authority. The room stilled. Whispers spread. Wells? Like the Wells family. Paul's phone slipped from his hand as he realized Sophie wasn't just a waitress. She was from a family as powerful as any here. David stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Sophie's face stayed calm, her eyes bright with quiet strength. Marcus spoke again, pointing at Sophie. This deal's alive because of her. And if you don't learn sign language in 6 months, you're out of my circle. The crowd gasped, protests rising. Paul begged, Mr. Kane, please, don't do this. A man in a pinstripe suit shouted, she's nobody. Sophie signed, her hand steady, nobody who speaks clearer than you. Marcus laughed, translating her words. The man sat down, his face burning. Reporters shoved forward, cameras flashing. One scribbled, Waitress saves billion-dollar deal with sign language. A young woman in a plain dress, clutching a locket, stepped forward. My cousin taught me sign language, she said softly. You're amazing. Sophie signed back, thank you, her hands gentle but sure. The moment cracked the room's hostility. Paul's face crumpled, his voice barely a whisper. How does she know sign language? Marcus turned to him, his eyes sharp. Maybe you should ask her, he said to Paul, his voice low but cutting. The room buzzed with tension, the crowd's murmurs growing sharper as they processed Sophie's fluency in sign language and David's unexpected arrival. Paul, his face slick with sweat, stammered, ask her? She's just... He stopped, catching Marcus's glare. Sophie signed, her hands moving with calm precision, you're loud, but you're not saying anything. Marcus translated, his tone sharp, and a ripple of uneasy laughter spread, quickly fading under the weight of her words. The man in the pinstripe suit, his face still red, muttered to his neighbor, this is a stunt. She's nobody. Sophie's eyes flicked to him, but she didn't respond, her silence louder than his jab. A woman in a silver gown, her diamonds catching the light, leaned forward, her voice sugary but venomous. So what? She's a secret genius now? A waitress? The crowd tittered, but it was brittle, their confidence cracking. Sophie moved to a nearby table, picking up a dropped napkin, her movements deliberate. She signed, judging doesn't make you right. Listening does. Marcus's voice carried her words, each one landing like a stone. The woman's smile faltered, and she sank back, her fingers twisting her napkin. David, still beside Sophie, gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze, his presence a quiet anchor. Whispers grew, some curious, some hostile. Wells family? Is she one of them? A man with a loud tie hissed, his voice carrying to nearby tables. The air shifted as a young waiter, his hands shaky, bumped into Sophie while rushing past with a tray. Glasses clinked, one tipping dangerously, but Sophie caught it, setting it down without a word. The waiter, barely 20, whispered, sorry, I didn't mean. She cut him off with a small nod, her eyes kind but firm. The woman in the gold dress, Laura, seized the moment, her voice loud. Clumsy help just like her. No wonder they're invisible. Laughter broke out, sharp and mean, but Sophie knelt to pick up a fallen fork, her hands steady. She signed, mistakes don't define you. Intentions do. Marcus translated, his voice steady, and the laughter choked off. The waiter's face flushed with gratitude, and he slipped back into the crowd, head down. Marcus paced the podium, his eyes scanning the room. You're all so quick to talk, but not one of you could answer me, he said, his voice cold. She did. He pointed at Sophie, who was now refilling a water glass, her movements unruffled. A man with slicked back hair, the one who'd spilled the wine, stood, his Rolex gleaming. This is a joke, Marcus. You're letting a waitress run the show. His voice dripped with disdain, and others nodded, their murmurs rising. Sophie signed, her hands fluid, you're shouting but you're not heard. Marcus's laugh was low, almost a growl, as he translated. The man's face twisted, and he sat, his hands fumbling with his glass. A reporter, her notepad out, pushed through the crowd, her voice eager. "Miss, why do you know sign language?" Sophie paused, her picture steady, and signed, "Because someone I loved needed it." Marcus's voice carried her words, and for a moment, the room softened. A woman in a plain dress, the one with the locket, nodded, her eyes bright. "My cousin's deaf too," she said softly. "I get it." Sophie signed back, "Thank you," her hands gentle. The reporters scribbled furiously, muttering, "This is gold. Waitress saves the day." But the hostility wasn't gone. Laura, in her gold dress, stood again, her voice sharp. "She's playing you, Marcus." A sob story to get attention. The crowd murmured, some nodding, their skepticism flaring. Sophie's hands paused, her eyes locking on Laura's. She signed, "Truth doesn't need your approval." Marcus translated, his voice steady, and the room's energy shifted again. Laura's face flushed, but she pressed on, her voice louder. "You're telling me a waitress outsmarts us all? Please." A man in a gray blazer, his tone condescending, chimed in. "She's probably some distant cousin of the Wells family, writing their name for clout." Whispers spread, the crowd grasping for ways to dismiss her. David's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, his hands still on Sophie's shoulder. She signed, "A name doesn't make you. Actions do." Marcus's voice rang out, and the man in the gray blazer adjusted his tie, his confidence slipping. The tension spiked as a woman in a red dress, her pearls gleaming, clapped mockingly. "What's next, Marcus? Promoting her to your board?" The laughter was nervous, uneven. Sophie didn't react, adjusting her apron with a slow, deliberate motion. She signed, "You laugh, but you're scared." Marcus translated, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the crowd. "She's right. You're terrified of someone who doesn't need your world to matter." The room went quiet, the weight of his words sinking in. Paul, still gripping his chair, tried to recover. "Mr. Kane, let's focus on the deal. We'll rework the numbers tonight." His voice was desperate, almost shrill. Marcus ignored him, his gaze fixed on Sophie. "Why did you learn it?" he asked, signing as he spoke. Sophie's hands moved, her signs steady but softer now. "My cousin couldn't hear. I learned so she wouldn't feel alone." Marcus nodded, his face unreadable, but his eyes held something new, respect. The crowd shifted, their whispers growing uncertain. A young woman in a corner, her dress simpler than the rest, stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "I learned sign from my brother," she said. "You're not alone." Sophie signed, "Thank you," her hands warm, and the woman smiled, stepping back into the crowd. The moment was small, but it cracked the room's hostility further. A man with a loud tie, Tom, stood, his face red with wine and anger. "This is a circus, Marcus. You're letting her make fools of us." His voice carried, drawing nods from others. Sophie signed, "You're making yourself the fool." Marcus translated, his voice sharp, and Tom's face twisted as he sat, his hands shaking. Reporters were frantic now, cameras flashing, one shouting, "Billionaire and Waitress in sign language showdown." Sophie stood still, her blonde bun gleaming, her face calm but unyielding. A server, her apron smudged, hesitated near Sophie, then slipped her another note. "You're my hero," it read. Sophie tucked it away, her eyes softening again. Marcus stepped down from the podium, moving closer to Sophie. "You saved this deal," he said, his voice low but clear. "Not them." He pointed at the crowd, who recoiled, their faces a mix of fear and indignation. Paul's knees buckled, and he leaned forward, his voice breaking. "Mr. Kane, please, don't let this ruin everything." Sophie signed, her hands steady. "It's not ruined. It's just starting." Marcus translated, his eyes locked on her. The crowd's murmurs grew chaotic, some protesting, others whispering about the Wells family. A woman in a green dress, her voice sharp, called out, "She's just a waitress, Marcus. You can't be serious." Sophie signed, serious enough to be heard. Marcus's voice carried her words, and the room's energy shifted again, the crowd's bravado crumbling. David, still beside Sophie, leaned in, his voice low. "You don't need to do this alone," he said. Sophie nodded, her eyes steady, and signed, "I'm not alone." Marcus translated, his voice softer now. The reporters were in a frenzy, one shouting, "Who is she, really?" Sophie adjusted her tray, setting it down with care. She signed, "Just someone who listens." Marcus's lips twitched into a smile as he translated. The woman in the plain dress, clutching her locket, spoke again, her voice stronger. "She's more than you think," she said. Sophie signed, "We all are." Marcus's voice carried her words, and the room fell into a tense, electric silence, waiting for what came next. Marcus, his navy suit sharp, stepped closer to her, his eyes steady. "She's right," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "You've got millions, but she's got something you don't, heart." The woman in the green dress, her sarcasm gone, sank into her seat, her hands fidgeting. Paul Reed, his gray suit damp with sweat, opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. The room waited, the air heavy with anticipation. A man in a pinstripe suit, his face flushed, stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "This is absurd, Marcus," he said, his voice shaking. "You're betting a $2 billion deal on a waitress?" Sophie signed, her hands fluid and unflinching. "Not a bet. A choice." Marcus translated, his tone firm, and the man's face twisted as he sat, his hands clenching his glass. Whispers spread, some hostile, others curious. "She's a Wells," a woman in a sapphire gown muttered, her diamonds glinting as she leaned toward her friend. "How did we miss that?" David Wells, Sophie's brother, stood silently beside her, his simple black suit commanding attention without a word. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder, a quiet signal of strength. A reporter, her camera flashing, pushed forward, her voice sharp. "Miss Miller, are you really a Wells? Why hide it?" Sophie's eyes met hers, steady and clear. She signed, "I didn't hide. I chose." Marcus's voice carried her words, and the reporter's pen paused, her eyes widening. The woman in the plain dress, still clutching her locket, stepped forward again. "She's not hiding," she said, her voice soft but firm. "She's real." Sophie signed, "Thank you," her hands gentle, and the woman nodded, her eyes bright with tears. The moment landed softly, but it shifted the room, the hostility fracturing further. Laura, the woman in the gold dress, stood, her earrings swaying as she forced a laugh. "This is a performance, Marcus. She's playing you for attention." Her voice was loud, desperate to reclaim control. Sophie signed, "You're loud, but you're not listening." Marcus translated, his voice steady, and Laura's face reddened. She sat, her fingers twisting her napkin into knots. Tom, the banker with the loud tie, tried to pile on, his voice slurred with wine. "She's nobody, Marcus. You're making a mistake." Sophie's hands moved, sharp and sure. "Nobody who's louder than you." Marcus's laugh was low as he translated, and Tom sank back, his face burning. Marcus raised a hand, silencing the room. "Starting today, she's my communications advisor," he said, pointing at Sophie. The crowd gasped, their voices rising in a chaotic mix of shock and protest. Paul's knees buckled, and he gripped the table, his voice breaking. "Mr. Kane, you can't. She's a waitress." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "She's the only one here who speaks my language." Sophie signed, "It's not about titles. It's about truth." Marcus translated, and the room's energy shifted, the crowd's bravado crumbling under her quiet strength. A young girl, no older than 10, slipped through the crowd, her bright eyes fixed on Sophie. "I know sign language too," she said, her hands moving clumsily but earnestly. "You're awesome." Sophie knelt, signing back, "You're awesome too." The girl beamed, hugging Sophie's waist. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbling. "Billionaire names waitress advisor in sign language stunner," one wrote. The crowd's murmurs softened, some faces showing reluctant respect. A server, her apron stained, approached Sophie, her hands trembling as she handed her another note. "You changed everything," it read. Sophie tucked it into her pocket, her eyes warm. The attacks didn't stop. A woman in a red dress, her pearls gleaming, stood, her voice dripping with fake pity. "No one respects a waitress sitting with CEOs," she said. Sophie signed. "Respect isn't given. It's earned." Marcus translated, his voice steady, and the woman's smile froze. Another guest, a man with a thin mustache, added, "The papers will laugh at this, Marcus." Sophie's hands moved. "Let them laugh. Truth lasts longer." Marcus's voice carried her words, and the man adjusted his tie, his confidence slipping. Years ago, Sophie had sat in her family's mansion, her cousin Lily teaching her sign language. Lily, deaf since birth, had signed, "You make me feel heard." Sophie had promised to keep signing, to carry that connection forward. Now, in the ballroom, that promise held her steady. She didn't need the crowd's approval. She'd learned to listen when it mattered most. The fallout came swiftly. Paul was fired the next morning, his company citing values misalignment. Laura's old cruel social media posts resurfaced, tanking her reputation. Tom lost a major client after his mockery went viral. The woman in the red dress, a marketing exec named Vivian, was dropped by her social circle when her mocking clap hit the news. Sophie didn't see it. She'd already left, slipping out with David under the city lights. Her steps were steady, her plain shoes clicking on the pavement. David's hand brushed hers, a quiet anchor. "You didn't need to prove anything," he said softly. Sophie smiled, her breath visible in the cool night air. "I wasn't proving. I was being." The world saw her now, not as a waitress, not as a Wells, but as Sophie. Reporters called her a symbol of quiet strength, her story spreading online. "Waitress teaches elite a lesson in respect," one headline read. The young girl from the ballroom, inspired, started a sign language club at her school. The woman with the locket began teaching others, citing Sophie's courage. Sophie didn't need the headlines. She'd spoken and they'd heard. Her cousin's lessons had carried her here, to a moment where her silence outshone their noise. The crowd's recognition wasn't loud, but it was real, etched in their stunned faces and the notes tucked in her pocket. She walked on, her hand in David's, her heart steady, knowing she'd made a difference. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good twist, and subscribe for more cinematic tales that hit you right in the heart. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from.